Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Knight b1 to c3. Knight g8 to f6. Bishop f1 to b5. Bishop f8 to b4. Castle kingside. Castle kingside. Bishop b5 takes c6. Bishop b4 takes c3. Pawn d2 takes c3. Pawn d7 takes c6. Queen d1 takes d8. Rook f8 takes d8. Bishop c1 to g5. Rook d8 to d6. Bishop g5 takes f6. Pawn g7 takes f6. Rook a1 to d1. Pawn f6 to f5. Knight f3 takes e5. Pawn f5 takes e4. Rook d1 to d4. Pawn e4 to e3. Pawn f2 takes e3. Bishop c8 to e6. Rook d4 takes d6. Pawn c7 takes d6. Knight e5 to f3. Bishop e6 takes a2. King g1 to f2. Bishop a2 to c4. Rook f1 to d1. Rook a8 to d8. Knight f3 to a5. Bishop c4 to b3. Pawn c2 takes b3. King g8 to g7. King f2 to f3. King g7 to f6. King f3 to a4. Rook d8 to e8. Rook d1 takes d6, check. Rook e8 to e6. Rook d6 takes e6, check. Pawn f7 takes e6. Knight e5 to d7, check. King f6 to g5. Knight d7 to f8. Pawn h7 to h5. King e4 to e5. Pawn c6 to c5. Knight f8 takes e6, check. King g5 to g4. Knight e6 takes c5. Pawn b7 to b6. Knight c5 to d7. Pawn b6 to b5. Pawn c3 to c4. Pawn b5 to b4. Pawn c4 to c5. Pawn a7 to a5. Pawn c5 to c6. Pawn h5 to h4. Pawn c6 to c7. King g4 to g5. Pawn e3 to e4. King g5 to g4. Knight d7 to c5. King g4 to g5. Knight c5 to b7. King g5 to g4. Knight b7 takes a5. King g4 to g5. Knight a5 to c6. Pawn h4 to h3. Pawn g2 takes h3. King g5 to g6. Pawn h3 to h4. King g6 to f7. Knight c6 takes b4. King f7 to e7. Pawn h4 to h5. King e7 to e8. King e5 to e6. King e8 to f8. Pawn h5 to h6. King f8 to e8. Pawn c7 to c8, promoting to queen, checkmate.